She was not born Russian, not born royal in any meaningful sense, and not born into a destiny that anyone around her could have predicted. A minor German princess arrived at the Russian court as a teenager, speaking a foreign language and carrying nothing but intelligence, ambition, and a quiet determination to survive. Within years, she had outmaneuvered an unpopular husband, cultivated the loyalty of powerful military men, and positioned herself at the centre of an empire she was never supposed to rule. In July 1762, she moved against her own husband in a palace coup that shocked the courts of Europe and changed Russian history forever. Then, days after the coup succeeded, her husband died under circumstances that no one has ever fully explained, and a shadow fell across her throne that would never entirely lift. For 34 years she would rule one of the world's largest empires, and the question of who she truly was, liberator or autocrat, philosopher or conqueror, enlightened empress or ruthless survivor, has never been fully answered. Welcome back to Whispered Empires, where the dust of forgotten centuries settles quietly into story. If this is the kind of history you enjoy, slow, careful, and told without hurry, consider liking the video and subscribing, but only if it genuinely feels right to you. And if you would like to leave a comment, share where in the world you are watching from tonight, and what time it is where you are. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people across many different cities and time zones are settling in for the same story at this hour. So find a comfortable position, let the day's weight fall away from your shoulders, and allow yourself to drift into the story of the Empress who expanded Russia. Tonight, we follow one of history's most extraordinary lives, a foreign princess who became the most powerful woman in the world. And now, let yourself drift into the story of Catherine the Great. Chapter 1. The German Princess, Birth, Childhood, and the Road to Russia. In the spring of 1729, in the old Pomeranian city of Stettin, a city of stone towers and cobbled streets pressed close against the cold Baltic winds, a child was born who would one day reshape the destiny of an empire she had never imagined as her own. Her name at birth was Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst. She came into the world on the 2nd of May, in a garrison town that belonged to the Kingdom of Prussia, in a region that today forms part of northwestern Poland. Nothing about the circumstances of her birth suggested greatness. She was the daughter of a minor German prince born into a principality so small and so modest that few outside the tight circles of German aristocracy would have known its name. The Principality of Anhalt-Zerbst was, in the language of its time, a sovereign imperial estate of the Holy Roman Empire. Its ruling family, the House of Ascania, held a seat in the imperial diet and exercised the formal dignities of sovereignty. But their domain was a quiet, provincial affair, far removed from the splendours of the great European courts. It was a world of measured ceremony and careful respectability, not of grand ambition. Sophie's father, Prince Christian August of Anhalt-Zerbst, embodied that world entirely. He was a serious man, devout in his Lutheran faith, disciplined in his habits, steady in his loyalties. He had served the Prussian crown with distinction, rising to the rank of Generalfeldmarschall and serving as governor of Stettin, the very city where Sophie was born. He was not a man of great political imagination, but he was a man of genuine integrity, and in his household order and piety were the foundations upon which daily life rested. It was Christian August who oversaw the early education of his daughter. He engaged a French governess for the young Sophie, along with tutors appropriate to her station, and under their guidance she received the kind of careful, measured upbringing typical of the minor German nobility. Languages, deportment, letters, the quiet architecture of a princely education, modest in its ambitions and steady in its rhythms, Yet Sophie's mother was an altogether different kind of person. Johanna Elizabeth of Holstein-Gottorp was a woman of restless energy and keen social appetite. Where her husband was reserved and content, she was ambitious and calculating. The court gossip of the great houses of Europe interested her far more than the domestic quiet of Stettin, and she moved through aristocratic circles with a watchful, searching eye, always alert to opportunity, always measuring the distances between ambition and achievement. Johanna's background made her an unusually well-connected figure in the tangled world of German dynastic politics. She belonged to the House of Holstein-Gottorp, a family whose branches stretched outward to touch some of the most consequential thrones of the era. Her brother, Adolf Frederick, would later become King of Sweden, and within that same extended family line stood Peter Ulrich, Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, the grandson of the great Russian Tsar Peter and the designated heir to the Russian imperial throne. This connection, though indirect, would prove to be the most significant thread in the entire fabric of young Sophie's future. Johanna understood the value of what she possessed, not in land or title, but in bloodline and proximity. And from early in Sophie's childhood, she worked quietly and persistently to turn that value into something tangible, escorting her daughter through the courts of German princes, presenting her as a suitable candidate for the dynastic marriage networks that bound aristocratic Europe together. Sophie herself grew up quietly observing all of this, and those who encountered her in those early years noticed something that set her apart from the ordinary daughters of Minoan princes. Even as a young girl, contemporaries remarked upon an unusual quality of mind. There was a restlessness to her intellect, an eager willingness to engage with ideas that went beyond the decorative learning expected of a princess in her position. She loved to read. She was drawn to conversation that had substance. She questioned things, not out of willfulness, but out of a genuine and searching curiosity about the nature of the world around her. Those who knew her in childhood sensed, even then, that here was a person who would not be content to remain merely ornamental. But for all her quiet gifts, Sophie's early life remained the life of a provincial German princess, and it might have stayed that way had history not intervened. Far to the east, in the vast and glittering court of the Russian Empress Elizabeth, a problem had been quietly gathering into urgency. Empress Elizabeth had come to power in 1741, seizing the Russian throne with the support of the Imperial Guard regiments after years of unstable succession that has seen 4 different monarchs follow one another in little more than 2 decades. Elizabeth was strong-willed, politically shrewd, and deeply devoted to the memory of her father, Peter the Great. Under her rule, Russia had returned to something resembling the vision of order and expansion that Peter had set in motion. The Senate was restored as a governing institution. Powerful advisors managed the machinery of the state, and the imperial court became one of the most spectacular in all of Europe, filled with Baroque architecture, artistic patronage, and lavish ceremony. But beneath that splendour, a quiet anxiety persisted. Elizabeth had no legitimate children of her own, and the succession remained uncertain. She had named as her heir a young man named Peter Fedorovich, born Karl Peter Ulrich, the son of her deceased sister Anna Petrovna and the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp. He was, in other words, the very same young man whose family connection to Johanna Elizabeth made young Sophie a plausible candidate for his hand. The problem was that Peter was not, by most accounts, a reassuring figure. He had been brought to Russia as a boy and converted to Orthodoxy, but he remained at heart a German prince with little affection for his adopted country. He was erratic, often childish in his enthusiasms, given to obsessive interest in toy soldiers and military drills, and showed little of the gravity or steadiness that the Russian throne would require. He had no children, and the dynastic succession was increasingly fragile. Empress Elizabeth needed a bride for her heir, a bride who was young and healthy, capable of bearing children, and clever enough to provide whatever steadiness Peter himself lacked. She wanted someone who could be converted to orthodoxy without great difficulty, who carried enough blood to be respectable but not so much political weight as to complicate Russian diplomacy. She wanted, in short, a German princess of modest origins and considerable personal capability. Johanna Elizabeth had spent years positioning her daughter for exactly this kind of moment. The invitation, when it came in early 1744, set everything in motion. Mother and daughter were summoned to Russia, to the court of Empress Elizabeth, to meet the heir and to be assessed for the role that would transform Sophie's life entirely. The journey itself was long and cold, carrying them across the winter landscapes of northern Europe and deep into Russian territory. For a girl raised in the modest garrison town of Stettin, the sheer scale of what she was moving toward must have registered slowly, like something glimpsed through fog, vast, luminous, and not entirely real. When Sophie arrived at the Russian imperial court, she encountered a world unlike anything her German childhood had prepared her for. The court of Empress Elizabeth was a spectacle of Baroque grandeur. Palaces designed by the great architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli, rooms filled with gilded surfaces and candlelight, a social world governed by elaborate hierarchies of protocol and favour, and at its centre sat the Empress herself, powerful and exacting, surrounded by advisors and favourites whose influence shaped every corner of court life. Sophie's first impressions were those of a young woman who understood, with remarkable clarity, what the moment required of her. She recognised immediately that her survival in this world would depend not on the modest accomplishment she had brought from Germany, but on how quickly and completely she could become something new. She threw herself into the Russian language with an intensity that surprised those around her. She worked with her tutor, Vasily Adadorov, studying his grammar notebooks late into the night while others slept. She practiced conversation wherever she could find it, forcing herself to speak Russian even when German would have been far easier. Empress Elizabeth had insisted on speaking to her in Russian, and Sophie met that demand not with reluctance, but with determination. Within months, the fluency she achieved was remarkable, enough to write, to correspond, to engage with the literature and customs of her new country with something approaching genuine understanding. The Russian courtiers watched this transformation with a kind of quiet approval. There was something in Sophie's earnestness that disarmed the wariness they might otherwise have felt toward a foreign princess. She was not performing deference, or if she was, she performed it so naturally that the distinction scarcely mattered. She studied the customs, she observed the rhythms of court life, she listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, she chose her words carefully. Empress Elizabeth, too, was won over, at least in these early months. The Empress appreciated the young girl's efforts and rewarded them with favour and encouragement, arranging the formal steps that would bind Sophie permanently to Russia. The conversion to Russian Orthodoxy was one such step. It was not a small thing, it meant setting aside the Lutheran faith in which her father had raised her, the faith he had never ceased to regard as the true foundation of a Christian life. Christian August had opposed his daughter's conversion, and that opposition was quietly noted and quietly set aside. The requirements of the Russian court and the ambitions of her mother left little room for sentiment. In the Russian Orthodox baptismal ceremony, Sophie received a new name. She became Catherine, linked by that name to Saint Catherine of Alexandria, the learned and steadfast virgin martyr, revered by the Church for her wisdom and her courageous faith. It was a name that carried weight, a name that connected its bearer to a tradition of feminine intelligence and moral seriousness. Whether the choice was deliberate or conventional, it would in time seem almost prophetic. The Russian courtiers found in the newly named Catherine a figure who had shaped herself to fit her new country with extraordinary speed and apparent sincerity. The Empress was pleased. The succession seemed, at least in its outward form, to be moving toward resolution. But not everything at court moved so smoothly. Johanna Elizabeth, who had worked so hard to engineer this moment, could not resist continuing to work once she had arrived. She made alliances with the French and German circles at court, cultivated friendships among those who opposed the pro-Austrian faction, led by the powerful Chancellor Alexei Bestujev-Ryumin, and eventually allowed herself to be drawn into serving as an agent of Frederick II of Prussia, passing information and trying to influence the direction of Russian foreign policy in Prussia's favour. It was a dangerous game, and she played it badly. Letters were intercepted, her associations were exposed. The Marquis de la Chetardie, one of her key allies, was expelled from Russia. Empress Elizabeth delivered a sharp and public reprimand, and in 1745 Johanna was banished entirely, sent back to Germany in disgrace. For the young woman who had just become Catherine, her mother's fall was both a personal wound and a political complication. Johanna had brought her here, had shaped her, positioned her, sacrificed her to the machinery of dynastic ambition. And now she was gone, leaving Catherine to face the court alone, surrounded by factions and rivalries she was only beginning to understand, stripped of even the imperfect protection a mother's presence might have provided. In those early months, the pressures were considerable. Catherine knew that her position was fragile. She could be dismissed, sent to a convent, or returned to her tiny German principality at the slightest misstep. The court demanded transformation, total, convincing, unwavering, and any sign of weakness or foreign loyalty could unravel everything her mother's ambitions had built. The heir apparent Peter, meanwhile, was already showing the erratic and contemptuous qualities that would define him, treating those around him with petulance, flaunting disrespect for Russian customs, and offering his future wife little in the way of warmth or partnership. And yet Catherine did not retreat. She absorbed the pressures quietly, continued her studies, deepened her understanding of the court's rhythms and its hidden currents, and carried herself with a steadiness that belied her age and circumstances. She had arrived as Sophie, a minor princess from a modest German principality, the daughter of a Prussian general and an ambitious, restless mother. She'd become Catherine, baptized into a new faith, immersed in a new language, grafted into the extraordinary and treacherous world of the Russian imperial court. The transformation was complete in name and beginning to take shape in substance, but becoming Catherine was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, in a marriage that would prove deeply unhappy, and in a court where survival required far more than a new name and a new religion. Chapter 2: The Unhappy Marriage, the Enlightened Mind, and the Path to Power. On the 21st of August in the year 1745, the Cathedral of Our Lady of Kazan in St. Petersburg filled with candlelight and ceremony. A young woman, not yet 17 years old, stood at the altar in the robes of a Russian Orthodox bride. She had already changed her name, from Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst to Catherine Alexeyevna, a transformation that marked not merely a new identity, but the beginning of an entirely new life. Her father was absent from the festivities. The marriage had been arranged not for love, but for dynasty, orchestrated by Empress Elizabeth herself to strengthen the ties between Russia and the Holstein-Gottorp line. The groom was Peter, heir to the Russian throne, and from the very first days the two could not have been more unlike one another. Peter was a man of narrow interests and restless immaturity. He was short of stature and soft-spoken in public, yet his private world was filled with the sounds of military drills rehearsed obsessively in the manner of the Prussian court, the scraping of a violin played badly, and the clinking of glasses filled too often. He held an almost fervent admiration for Frederick the Great of Prussia, a foreign king he referred to as his master, and he wore his German customs like armour against the Russian world that surrounded him. He dismissed Russian dress and Russian tradition. He neglected the Orthodox Church. He placed foreign officials in positions of authority, and he treated his young wife with a contempt that seemed almost effortless. He called her an idiot. He called her a good-for-nothing. He pursued mistresses openly, placing one of his favourites in a bedroom adjoining his own in the Winter Palace, as though the indignity were simply another domestic arrangement. The marriage remained unconsummated for years. When Catherine finally gave birth to a son, the future Paul I, born on the 20th of September 1754, Peter's response was not one of warmth or relief. He screamed at her to go to the devil, and then Empress Elizabeth walked into the room and took the infant away. Paul was carried into the Empress's private chambers and raised largely apart from his mother. The question of the boy's parentage would follow Catherine in for the rest of her life. Rumours circulated that Paul's true father was not Peter at all, but Sergei Saltykov, a man Catherine had been close to during the early years of the marriage. Catherine herself was evasive on the matter, alluding to Saltykov in early memoirs before later maintaining that Peter was the true father. The uncertainty was dangerous. Catherine's position at court rested in part on her ability to provide a legitimate Romanov heir, and any shadow over Paul's origins threatened not only her reputation, but her very survival within the palace walls. She would have 2 more children during the marriage. A daughter, Grand Duchess Anna Petrovna, was born but died in early childhood. A second son, later known as Alexei Bobrinsky, came into the world in 1762, widely believed to be the child of a man named Grigory Orlov, a figure who would come to shape Catherine's life in ways that reached far beyond matters of the heart. But all of that lay ahead. In those long, difficult years as Grand Duchess, Catherine existed in a kind of gilded confinement. The court expected her to be decorative and submissive. She was excluded from the rooms where decisions were made. She was surrounded by people whose loyalties belonged first to the Empress and only secondarily to anyone else. She had no independent authority, no political voice, no freedom of movement that was truly her own. So she turned to books. In the quiet hours of the court, often alone in her private chambers, Catherine read. She had mastered French and the language of European intellectual life, and through it she gained access to a world of ideas that the Russian court could not confine or take from her. She read Voltaire, whose critiques of despotism and whose passionate advocacy for reason and religious tolerance became a kind of mirror through which she began to understand what an enlightened ruler might look like. She read Montesquieu, whose work, The Spirit of the Laws, offered her something practical and architectural, the idea that laws should be rational, proportional, and derived from the sovereign's enlightened will, rather than from arbitrary tradition. She read Diderot and the Great Encyclopédie, which reinforced her belief that knowledge, when widely shared, could transform institutions and societies. And she read Tacitus, whose cool, unsentimental accounts of Roman emperors gave her something perhaps more immediately useful than philosophy, an understanding of how power actually worked, of the hidden motives that moved rulers and courts, of the pragmatic realities that lay beneath the surface of ceremony and pageantry. These books did not merely educate her, they shaped her. They gave her a vision of what she might become, and they gave her the patience to wait. She also found ways to bring the world of ideas physically into her life. She acquired texts in carefully concealed parcels. She used her correspondence, which grew over the years into an extraordinary network of intellectual exchange, to request and receive manuscripts and publications from across Europe. In 1763, she would begin a formal correspondence with Voltaire himself, a dialogue that would eventually produce nearly 200 letters, a remarkable exchange between the aging philosopher and the Empress who admired him. She later acquired Diderot's personal library, arranging for him to keep his books until his death, paying him as their keeper, an act of extraordinary generosity that was also, unmistakably, an act of political calculation. She eventually purchased Voltaire's posthumous library as well, adding it to the growing imperial collection. For Catherine, the life of the mind and the life of power were never entirely separate things. While she read and cultivated her understanding of the world, she was also very quietly cultivating people. 18 years as Grand Duchess gave her time that she used with deliberate care. She observed which officers commanded genuine loyalty from their men. She understood which noblemen resented the court's direction. She knew which factions were held together by genuine conviction and which by mere proximity to power. She listened, she remembered, and she built, slowly and without spectacle, a coalition. The most important figure in that coalition arrived through a combination of chance and recognition. Grigory Grigorievich Orlov was a Russian artillery officer, tall and handsome and utterly at ease with physical courage. He had fought in the 7 Years' War. He had come to St. Petersburg escorting a Prussian prisoner, and somewhere in that corridor between war and court, he had encountered Catherine. By around 1760, they had begun a relationship that was simultaneously personal and political, a partnership that would reach its full significance in the crisis that was coming. Orlov brought more than himself. He brought his brothers, 4 of them, men who held influence among the elite guard regiments, who commanded resources and loyalty that Catherine could not have assembled on her own. Together, the Orlov family became the most decisive instrument of her emerging power. Meanwhile, the world around Catherine was shifting. Empress Elizabeth's health had been declining for years. After a fainting spell in 1757, she suffered increasingly from edema, convulsions, and a series of strokes that left her frail and confined to her chambers. The court, sensing the approach of an uncertain transition, grew restless with faction and rivalry. Foreign envoys recalculated their positions, ministers maneuvered for influence over a monarch who could no longer impose her will, and the man who stood next in line, Peter, gave no reassurance to anyone who was watching. On the 5th of January 1762, Empress Elizabeth died. Peter came to the throne. What followed was a reign so brief and so alienating that it seemed almost designed to hasten its own end. Peter withdrew Russian forces from the 7 Years' War and signed a peace with Prussia that returned every territory Russia had fought and bled to gain. He introduced Prussian uniforms and Prussian drill into the Russian army. He secularized the vast lands of the Orthodox Church, transferred them to the state, and moved to lift restrictions on the old believers, gestures the clergy interpreted as a fundamental assault on the Church's authority and identity. He dismissed experienced officers and placed foreign favourites in positions of influence, and he began to speak openly of his intentions regarding Catherine, intentions that reportedly included divorce and the possibility of removing her entirely from the succession. For Catherine, this was not merely a political crisis, it was an existential one. She understood clearly that without the protection of the court and the guard, she faced imprisonment, exile, or worse. She also understood that Peter had already done much of her work for her. The nobles were offended, the military was furious, the clergy was alarmed, and the guard officers who had formed the spine of imperial power for decades were deeply uneasy. The conspiracy that had been quietly taking shape since the earliest days of Peter's reign now began to accelerate. Beyond the Orlov brothers, it drew in senior officers of the Preobrazhensky and Izmailovsky regiments. It drew in courtiers and statesmen, and Nikita Panin among them, who feared where Peter's reforms were leading. It drew in elements of the high clergy. The pieces were being assembled, the promises were being made, and Catherine watched and measured and waited for the moment. The conspiracy had been carefully built, the allies were in place, and the moment was approaching, but seizing an empire would require not only courage and planning, but the kind of ruthless decisiveness that separates those who survive history from those who are consumed by it. Chapter 3: The Coup, the Crown, and the Shadow of Peter III. On the 5th of January 1762, the long reign of Empress Elizabeth came quietly to its end. She had ruled Russia for more than 2 decades, and in the hours after her passing, her nephew ascended to the throne as Emperor Peter III. The transition was swift and formal, as such things always are at the highest levels of empire. And yet, from the very first days of his reign, something in the air of the Russian court felt unsettled, as though a great balance had been disturbed and had not yet found its resting place. Peter was not a man who understood his own kingdom. He had been raised in the traditions of the German Duchy of Holstein, and his admiration for Prussia, for its king, Frederick II, for its drill formations and its military precision, was deep and unconcealed. Where the Russian nobility expected reverence for their traditions, Peter offered impatience. Where the Orthodox clergy expected deference, Peter offered indifference and something close to contempt. In the weeks and months that followed his coronation, a series of decisions unfolded that would quietly seal his fate. In February of 1762, Peter withdrew Russia from the 7 Years' War. For years, Russian armies had fought across Prussia, had bled and sacrificed and advanced, had brought the empire close to securing significant territorial gains, and then, by imperial decree, it was simply over. The Treaty of St. Petersburg, signed in May of 1762, returned every conquest to Frederick's kingdom. Russia's allies felt abandoned. Russia's generals felt insulted. The victories won by ordinary soldiers seemed to dissolve into nothing, erased by the stroke of a pen wielded by a Tsar who openly admired the very king they'd been fighting. The army did not forget this. In the early spring of that same year, Peter moved against the Russian Orthodox Church. The vast lands held by the clergy, lands and the peasants who worked them, accumulated over centuries of devotion and patronage, were transferred into the hands of the state. The economic foundation of the church hierarchy was swept away in an instant. And as if this were not enough, Peter eased restrictions on the old believers, those dissenters whom the Orthodox establishment had long suppressed, inviting those who had been exiled to return freely. To the clergy, this felt like a wound struck twice in the same place. The Tsar, it seemed to them, was not merely indifferent to their faith, he was its adversary. He reorganized the army along Prussian lines, new uniforms, new drills, new formations that felt foreign and strange to men who had served under Russian banners all their lives. The Imperial Guards, those proud regiments garrisoned in the capital, drawn almost entirely from the nobility, deeply conscious of their privileges and their identity, looked at their new emperor and felt something harden inside them. And then there were the preparations for a war against Denmark, a conflict driven not by Russian interests, but by Peter's personal dynastic claims in the region of Schleswig. This, for many in the military, was the final measure of a reign that had already given them more than enough to resent. Amid all of this, a woman waited. She had been watching, planning, and gathering quiet support for some time. Catherine, the Emperor's wife, had spent years cultivating relationships with officers of the guard, with courtiers, with intellectuals, with anyone who might one day be useful. She had learned to present herself with grace and patience, and she had understood something essential, that in Russia, in this particular century, power did not simply pass through bloodlines. It moved through armies. The conspiracy that formed around her was careful and deliberate. At its centre stood the Orlov brothers, Grigory, her closest confidant and lover, who worked among the guard officers with charm and persuasion, and his brother Alexei, whose temperament was rather more direct. Together they built the architecture of a coup, quietly and without ceremony. The moment it became urgent arrived on the night of the 8th of July, 1762. Word reached Catherine that one of the key conspirators had been arrested. Peter had discovered something, or enough of something, to act. The conspirators could wait no longer. Just after midnight, Alexei Orlov appeared at Catherine's residence at Peterhof. The time, he told her, was now. She left in a carriage, accompanied by a small retinue, moving through the summer darkness toward the barracks of the Izmailovsky regiment. By 1 in the morning, she stood before the soldiers on their parade ground. She spoke to them, briefly, passionately, in the manner of someone who understood that armies are moved not only by orders, but by feeling. The regiment swore its loyalty. They marched through the city. By 2 in the morning, the Semyonovsky regiment had joined them. By 3, the Preobrazhensky regiment, after a moment of hesitation, also declared for Catherine. At 3:30, the Archbishop of Kazan entered the palace, read her manifesto aloud and blessed her as sovereign. In the courtyard outside, nobles, clergy and merchants had gathered. They acclaimed her. Throughout all of this, Catherine wore the uniform of the Imperial Guard, the blue coat of the Life Guards regiment. It was a deliberate and powerful gesture. She was not merely a wife claiming her husband's throne. She was presenting herself as a military leader, as someone endorsed by the very forces that protected the empire. The visual message was unmistakable. The army recognized one of their own. Peter, meanwhile, had travelled to Peterhof expecting to confront the situation. He found the gates closed. He attempted to reach Kronstadt by boat, hoping the naval fortress would shelter him. But when his vessel approached, the cannons of the fortress turned to meet him. The fleet had already been ordered not to allow him to disembark. His small escort persuaded him to sign a formal document of abdication. By the early hours of the morning, the document was done. Peter III had surrendered his throne without a battle. By 6:30 in the morning, Catherine had returned to the Winter Palace to the sound of cheering. The grandees of the empire came before her. The clergy offered their blessing. The formal proclamation was made at the Cathedral of Our Lady of Kazan on Nevsky Prospect, where the Archbishop of Novgorod declared her sovereign autocrat, Catherine II, Empress of all the Russias. Her son Paul, 8 years old, was named heir to the throne. She appeared with him on the balcony of the Winter Palace, presenting herself not only as ruler but as mother, as continuity, as future. Peter was taken to the estate of Ropsha, a modest house on the palace grounds outside the capital, where he was held under close guard, isolated from the world, provided with little comfort. He remained there in a kind of suspended silence, removed from everything he had so briefly and so disastrously tried to govern. On the 17th of July 1762, barely a week after the coup, Peter III was dead. The official announcement described a sudden illness, a hemorrhoidal colic, an apoplectic stroke. The burial was quiet, without ceremony, at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery. There was no public mourning. Catherine expressed her condolences and moved forward. But the questions that gathered in the days and weeks that followed would not be so easily quieted. A letter existed written by Alexei Orlov from Ropsha to Catherine in the aftermath of Peter's death. In it, Orlov described a violent quarrel at dinner, a struggle between Peter and Prince Fyodor Baryatinsky, guards who could not intervene in time. The letter was confessional in tone, raw in a way that formal reports rarely are. Orlov and the other officers, he wrote, deserved death for what had happened. The letter was the only contemporary testimony that attributed Peter's death to something other than natural causes, and its existence changed the texture of everything that came before and after it. Historians have debated the circumstances ever since. Some have pointed to the bruising reportedly found on Peter's body, the swollen neck, the marks that might suggest strangulation. Others have noted the competing theories: suffocation, a blow, poisoning, or a brawl that went further than anyone intended. The official account has never been accepted with complete confidence. The truth, if it exists somewhere beneath the accumulated weight of time, has not fully surfaced. As for Catherine's own role, whether she ordered the death, permitted it, or simply received it as an outcome she did not resist, that question has followed her legacy ever since. There are no surviving orders from her hand. There is no direct testimony. What exists is the pattern of events, the proximity of her allies, the swiftness of her gratitude toward those who had served her, and the absence of any investigation into the manner of her husband's passing. The degree of her personal involvement remains, as historians have long concluded, unresolved. What is clear is that Catherine moved quickly to contain whatever consequences the death might bring. The Senate and the Holy Synod were secured. Oaths of allegiance were administered to the regiments and the nobility. The official narrative was established and reinforced. Other threats were addressed just as methodically. Ivan VI, the deposed infant emperor who had spent his entire life imprisoned in the Schlisselburg fortress, remained a living alternative claim to the throne. Catherine issued strict instructions concerning him, instructions that would be carried out 2 years later, in 1764, when a rescue attempt ended in his death. The pretender known as Princess Tarakanova, who claimed descent from a former emperor, was eventually arrested and held in captivity. The architecture of Catherine's rule was built not only upon support, but upon the careful neutralization of every credible challenge. European courts watched all of this with careful attention. Frederick of Prussia, who had benefited enormously from Peter's treaty, expressed initial protest but within weeks accepted Catherine's accession and moved to formalize relations with the new Empress. Austria, wary but pragmatic, normalized its dealings with St. Petersburg. France, after a period of cautious observation, extended congratulations and sought to renew its diplomatic ties. The coup, Peter's death, the quietly swallowed scandal, all of it was absorbed into the practical machinery of continental diplomacy. The world in the end dealt with the ruler who held the throne. With the throne secured and the shadow of Peter's death quietly absorbed into the machinery of empire, Catherine turned to the immense work of transforming herself from a usurper into a ruler worthy of the civilization she had seized. Chapter 4: The Enlightened Empress, Reform Contradiction, and the Pugachev Rebellion. There is a particular kind of ruler who holds a book in one hand and a scepter in the other, who speaks of equality in candlelit salons while the fields beyond the palace walls remain unchanged. Catherine the Great was such a ruler, a woman of enormous intellectual appetite and genuine philosophical curiosity, and yet one whose grandest ideals would forever bend and yield to the harder realities of power. From the mid-1760s onward, Catherine maintained one of the most celebrated correspondences in European history. Across the long winter months, letters travelled between St. Petersburg and Paris, between the imperial court and the world of the philosophe. With Voltaire, Catherine exchanged roughly 38 letters written in refined French, conversations that touched on religious tolerance, legal reform, the nature of monarchy, and the image of Russia in the eyes of an increasingly curious Europe. Voltaire, ever the charming flatterer, praised her as an enlightened sovereign. Catherine, in turn, welcomed his admiration and used it carefully, cultivating prestige among European intellectuals, while never surrendering an inch of her actual authority. She went further still. Denis Diderot, the great encyclopedist, was invited to St. Petersburg itself. He was granted daily audiences with the Empress, given a generous pension, and shown the growing collections of the Hermitage. He spoke candidly about her draft legal code, urging her to consider the abolition of serfdom. Jean Le Rond d'Alembert offered scientific and philosophical counsel that shaped her thinking on education and law. And from the writings of Cesare Beccaria, that clear-eyed Italian thinker who had argued so persuasively against torture and arbitrary punishment, Catherine borrowed more than 100 articles for the document that would become the centerpiece of her reforming ambitions. That document was the nakaz, the legislative instruction. Catherine worked on it from around 1765, and the finished version appeared on the 10th of August 1767, published in Russian, German, Latin and French. Organised into 22 chapters and 655 articles, it was a remarkable synthesis of Enlightenment thought applied, at least in aspiration, to the governance of the largest empire on earth. From Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws alone, more than 400 articles were drawn. The nakaz proclaimed the equality of all men before the law. It condemned torture. It sought to limit the use of the death penalty. It called for uniform application of justice, modest religious tolerance, and the modernization of trade and industry. It even gestured, though carefully and without resolution, at the troubled question of serfdom. To examine and refine these principles, Catherine convened the Legislative Commission of 1767, a vast consultative assembly of over 600 representatives drawn from nobles, merchants, state peasants, Cossacks, industrialists, and various peoples of the empire. It was an extraordinary gathering, convened first in Moscow and later moving to St. Petersburg, sitting through 203 sessions across 2 years. And yet, for all its ambition, the Commission produced no new code of law. The assembly was too large, its interests too divided. The nobility in particular resisted any measure that might loosen their grip on the serf population. More than half of the nakaz's provisions were diluted or discarded before they could be debated seriously. The serfs themselves had no voice in the room at all. The commission was eventually dissolved, its practical achievements modest. But it had served another purpose. It had given Catherine an intimate portrait of her empire's grievances, its desires and its fractures. The subcommittees it produced would later inform subsequent legislation. The conversations it generated would quietly shape what came after. In other areas, Catherine's reforming energy found more tangible expression. The Free Economic Society, founded in St. Petersburg in 1765 at her suggestion, was Russia's first learned society, devoted to spreading agricultural knowledge, improving farming techniques, and stimulating trade and manufacturing. It attracted prominent European economists, published practical journals, promoted new crops, and helped carry Enlightenment ideas about rational administration into the Russian countryside. In education, Catherine had made changes that would outlast her reign. The Cadet Corps was reorganized so that students received a broad curriculum encompassing sciences, philosophy, history, and ethics, alongside military preparation. Under the direction of Ivan Betskoy, European textbooks were translated into Russian, and plans laid for a nationwide system of schooling. The 1786 Russian Statute of National Education created a network of state-funded primary schools and secondary schools in every provincial capital, free of charge, open to all freeborn subjects, and formally welcoming to both boys and girls. By the end of her reign, some 62,000 pupils were enrolled across roughly 549 schools. Among these institutions, one stood apart in its significance. The Smolny Institute of Noble Maidens, founded in St. Petersburg in 1764, was the first state school for girls not only in Russia but in all of Europe. Initially a closed academy for daughters of the aristocracy, it soon opened a second section for girls of less elevated birth, slowly extending the reach of formal education beyond the narrow world of the nobility. The women it educated would become teachers, cultural participants, and the quiet architects of a slowly changing society. And in the arts, Catherine's ambitions were no less commanding. Beginning in 1764 with the purchase of 225 Flemish and Dutch masterworks from a Berlin merchant, she assembled one of the most extraordinary art collections the world had ever seen. Entire private galleries were acquired, from Saxony, from Paris, from the estates of English prime ministers. Gems, cameos, classical antiquities, and the private libraries of Diderot and Voltaire joined thousands of paintings in the rooms of the small hermitage, an annex to the Winter Palace that would eventually grow into the great museum that bears its name today. She commissioned the Marble Palace, the neoclassical Taurida Palace, the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo. She transformed St. Petersburg, boulevard by boulevard, embankment by embankment, into a city that could hold its own among the great capitals of Europe. And yet, beneath all of this, beneath the letters and the legislation, the paintings and the palaces, the foundations of Russian society remained unmoved. The serfs remained bound to the land. They could be bought and sold. They could be sent to Siberia at a landlord's whim. Catherine introduced modest measures, limiting certain forms of punishment, establishing bureaucratic channels for complaints, but she stopped far short of any genuine reform. She knew that her throne rested on the support of the nobility, and the nobility's wealth rested on serf labour. To disturb that arrangement was to risk everything. In 1773 the arrangement was disturbed anyway. From the eastern steppes, from among the Yake Cossacks of the Ural River region, a figure emerged who would shake the empire to its foundations. His name was Yermelian Ivanovich Pugachev, a Don Cossack born around 1742, a veteran of the 7 Years' War and the Russo-Turkish campaigns, a man who had spent years as a fugitive and who had listened carefully to the grievances of the people he passed among. And then he made a claim that electrified the borderlands of the Russian world. He was, he declared, the true Emperor Peter III, not dead, merely hidden, now returned to reclaim his throne and deliver his suffering people. The claim was powerful precisely because so many wished it to be true. Peter III had been deposed and killed, and the memory of that deposition had never fully settled. Among the Cossacks, whose ancient freedoms had been eroded by Catherine's centralizing reforms, among the serfs who laboured without hope of relief, among the Bashkirs and Tatars and Kalmyks whose lands had been encroached upon and whose faiths had been suppressed, among old believers who longed for the restoration of their religious practices, among all of these peoples, the idea of a returning Tsar who would sweep away the abuses of the present order carried an almost mythic force. Pugachev's army swelled. At its height, his forces numbered perhaps 100,000 men, Cossacks, serfs, factory and mine workers from the Urals, Bashkir cavalry, Tatar horsemen and dispossessed peoples of a dozen different nations, each carrying their own particular grievance, each bound together by the shared desire for something different from what they had. The rebels swept through the Yike region, besieged Orenburg, moved north and westward. In July of 1774, they captured and burned the great city of Kazan. They threatened Samara. They moved along the Volga, and the name of Pugachev travelled ahead of them like smoke on the wind, raising fear in the halls of the Winter Palace. Catherine's response was initially slow. The revolt had begun far away, in territories the court could not easily imagine. But as the scale of the uprising became impossible to ignore, she mobilised. General Michelson led the initial campaigns. Eventually, the empire's finest commanders were brought to bear, among them the formidable Alexander Suvorov, and the weight of the imperial military began to tell. The rebellion's momentum faltered. Its forces were defeated in engagements that grew steadily more decisive. In the end, it was not the imperial army alone that undid Pugachev. His own Cossack followers, calculating their survival, betrayed him. He was seized, transported to Moscow in an iron cage, tried before the Senate and sentenced to death. On the 10th of January 1775, before a gathered crowd, he was executed, beheaded first and then his limbs removed, his body burned. Several of his closest associates shared his fate. The spectacle was deliberately public, deliberately severe. Catherine intended it to be read as a message, written in the clearest possible terms. This was what awaited any hand raised against the imperial order, but the rebellion had already changed Catherine in ways she may not have fully acknowledged even to herself. The depth of the discontent she had witnessed, the sheer number of people who'd been willing to follow a Cossack fugitive into open war against the empire, persuaded her that any further concession to the lower orders was too dangerous to contemplate. The reforming spirit of her early reign, already compromised, now retreated further. In 1775, she issued a sweeping provincial reform, reorganising the empire into uniformly sized provinces and districts, placing governors and administrative boards at every level, creating separate courts for civil, criminal and social matters, and establishing boards of social welfare to oversee hospitals, schools and workhouses. It was government extended into the periphery, and not to liberate, but to control. To ensure that the next time discontent stirred in the distant steppes, the machinery of authority would be close enough to respond, and in 1785 she issued the Charter to the Nobility, a document that codified noble privilege with formal legal permanence, cementing their exemption from compulsory service, reinforcing their control over their estates, and leaving the serfs no closer to freedom than they had been before. The French Revolution of 1789 completed this transformation. The sight of a monarchy overturned, of nobles dragged from their estates, of ancient authority dissolved in the name of the people. This was not for Catherine an inspiration, it was a warning. The violent overthrow of the French crown confirmed what she had suspected since Pugachev's cages were pulled through the streets of Moscow, that the ideals of the Enlightenment, carried too far, too fast in the wrong hands, could devour the very civilization they claimed to serve. She drew back, she censored, she watched and she hardened. She had spent decades corresponding with the greatest minds of her age, filling her palaces with their books and their art, writing a legal code in their language, building schools in their spirit. And she had also spent those same decades ensuring that the foundations of her power remained untouched. The contradiction was not incidental, it was the very shape of her reign. The enlightened Empress had always known, somewhere beneath the letters and the philosophy, that the light she carried illuminated only so far. Beyond its reach, the steppe stretched endlessly into darkness. and the darkness had answered. Even as Catherine hardened her grip on power at home, her eyes were turned outward, toward warm southern seas, ancient trade routes, and an empire to the south that Russia had fought for generations to overcome. Chapter 5. Wars, Crimea, and the partition of Poland, building the imperial map. There is a particular kind of ambition that does not announce itself loudly. It moves quietly, deliberately, like water, finding the lowest path through stone. Over decades it reshapes the landscape entirely, and when one finally pauses to look back, the world has become something unrecognizable from what it once was. Such was the foreign policy of Catherine the Great. From the earliest years of her reign, Catherine carried within her a vision of what Russia could become. Not merely a kingdom of forests and frozen plains, but a true empire stretching from the Baltic to the warm southern seas. She spoke of this openly, declaring her wish to join the Caspian Sea with the Black Sea, and to link both with the North Sea, weaving Russia's rivers and coastlines into a continuous thread of commerce and military reach. In her mind, Russia was the natural heir to the Eastern Roman world, the protector of Orthodox Christianity, the power destined to fill the ancient void left by the fall of Constantinople. This was not fantasy, it was a plan, patient, methodical, and ultimately transformative. The first great test of that plan came not through diplomacy alone, but through war. In the autumn of 1768, the Ottoman Empire declared war on Russia. The causes were tangled and many. Russian armies had moved into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia had long been meddling in Ottoman-adjacent affairs, and the Turks watched with mounting alarm as Catherine's ambitions grew more visible with each passing season. For the Porte, the moment had come to push back. It was a decision they would come to regret. Over the years that followed, Russian forces swept through Ottoman Moldavia and Wallachia, pressing southwards with a persistence that surprised even Russia's own admirers. The Battle of Kargil, fought in the summer of 1770, brought a crushing Russian victory over a far larger Ottoman force. Key fortresses fell, Khotin, Azov, and with each one Russia's grip on the borderlands tightened. But the most astonishing chapter of that first war did not unfold on land at all. It unfolded at sea, in waters far from Russia's own shores. A Russian fleet, assembled from the Baltic, sailed thousands of miles around the continent into the eastern Mediterranean, a journey extraordinary in its audacity. Under the command of Count Alexei Orlov, with the tactical skill of Admiral Grigory Spiridov and the assistance of British naval officers, this fleet met the Ottoman armada anchored off the coast near Cheshme in July of 1770. The engagement that followed was swift and devastating. Fire ships moved through the night among the crowded Ottoman vessels. By morning, the Ottoman fleet was destroyed. 16 ships of the line, 6 frigates, and countless smaller craft burned or sunk, while the Russians lost only a single ship. The Aegean lay open. A blockade of Istanbul became a possibility. The message sent to every court in Europe was unmistakable. Russia had become a naval power of consequence. The war drew to a close in 1774 with the signing of the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, a document that reshaped the map of the region more thoroughly than any agreement in generations. Russia received the port of Azov, the fortresses of Kerch and Yenikale on the Crimean coast, the Kinburn fortress, and the fertile Yedesan territory between the Bug and Dnieper rivers. The Crimean Khanate, which had been an Ottoman vassal for 3 centuries, was declared formally independent, a declaration that in practice placed it firmly within Russia's sphere of influence. Perhaps most significantly, Russia gained the right to protect Orthodox Christians throughout the Ottoman Empire, a clause that would serve as diplomatic leverage for decades to come. The treaty was a beginning, not an ending. At the heart of everything that followed stood one figure more than any other: Grigory Potemkin. Potemkin had risen from modest origins to become Catherine's most indispensable partner. He had helped secure her accession in the coup of 1762. He had distinguished himself in the First Turkish War, and by 1774 he had become something far more than a military commander. He was her lover, her closest confidant, and possibly, if the whispers of historians are to be believed, her secret husband. Catherine's own letters referred to him repeatedly as her husband, language she used for no other man in her life. Whether a formal ceremony ever took place remains beyond certain proof, but the emotional and political bond between them was unlike anything else in her reign. Potemkin was appointed Governor-General of New Russia, the vast southern steppe that Russian arms had won, but Russian settlers had yet to fill. What he accomplished there over the following years was remarkable. He suppressed the old Cossack hosts. He established administrative systems across territories that had known little central governance. He founded cities, Kherson in 1778, the naval base of Sevastopol, the port of Nikolaev, the inland centre of Yekaterinoslav. He organised the creation of a Black Sea fleet where none had existed before. He settled colonists by the hundreds of thousands, Russians, foreigners, Jews, transforming empty steppe into a functioning imperial frontier. And he turned his eyes toward Crimea. The peninsula had been nominally independent since Kuchuk-Kainaka, but independence was a fragile fiction. Internally, the Crimean Khanate was torn apart by competing factions. The reform-minded Khan Shahingirai, installed with Russian support, faced constant opposition from traditionalist nobles and repeated uprisings, including a significant rebellion in 1781 and 1782. Ottoman influence waned. Russian troops were never far away. By 1783, the situation was ripe for the final step. Catherine issued her proclamation of annexation in April of that year. Potemkin was appointed to administer the new territory. The timing had been chosen with care. France was preoccupied with its conflict with Britain, Austria had declared its support for Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, exhausted and diplomatically isolated, lacked the allies needed to mount a military response. By January of 1784, the Porte formally recognised the loss in the Treaty of Constantinople. Crimea had become Russian soil. The peninsula mattered enormously, not only as a geographical prize, but as a symbol and a gateway. It closed the gap between Russia's Ukrainian frontier and the foothills of the Caucasus. It provided the anchorage for the new Black Sea fleet. It transformed Russia's southern exposure from a vulnerability into a position of dominance. In 1787, Catherine herself travelled south to see what had been built. The journey became one of the great spectacles of the age, a royal procession through the new cities, the rebuilt towns, the decorated waterfronts. It was during this journey that the legend of Potemkin villages was born, the tale that Potemkin had erected false painted facades of prosperous settlements to deceive his Empress. Later scholarship has largely dissolved that myth. What Potemkin arranged were genuine towns enhanced with theatrical flair, flowers, triumphal arches, fireworks, the embellishments of a showman rather than the deceptions of a fraud. The new lands were real, the cities were real, the fleet riding at anchor in the harbour was real, but the journey also carried a darker undercurrent. The Ottoman Empire watched the spectacle with growing alarm. That same year it issued its demands. Russia must evacuate Crimea and surrender its Black Sea territories. Catherine rejected the ultimatum entirely. The Second Russo-Turkish War had begun. This second conflict proved longer and harder than the first, but its outcome confirmed everything the earlier war had established. On land, The campaigns were shaped by the genius of Alexander Suvorov, a commander who had never lost a battle and who brought to each engagement an almost supernatural combination of boldness and tactical precision. At Kinburn in 1787, Russian forces repelled Ottoman amphibious landings. At Foksani and Rymnik in 1789, Suvorov shattered far larger Ottoman armies with losses so disproportionate they seemed to belong to legend rather than history. At Rymnik, a force of perhaps 7,000 Russians and 18,000 Austrians defeated an Ottoman army estimated at around 100,000 men. Then came Ismail. The fortress of Ismail stood on the Danube, massive, modern, considered by many to be impregnable. Suvorov examined it, consulted his maps, and in December of 1790 stormed it in a single audacious assault. The fortress fell. The war's conclusion was now only a matter of time. The Treaty of Jassy, signed in January of 1792, confirmed everything Russia had won. The annexation of Crimea was formally recognised. The Yedesan territory, including the future port of Odessa and the fortress of Ochakov, passed to Russia. The Dniester River became the new boundary in Europe. The north coast of the Black Sea from the Dniester to the Kuban now belonged entirely to the Russian Empire. The Greek project, Catherine's grand dream of dismantling the Ottoman Empire, reviving a Russian-backed Byzantine state at Constantinople, and placing her grandson Constantine upon its throne, had not fully materialized. But its pieces had been laid. The foundations existed. The vision remained alive, even if the full architecture of it would fall to later generations. While the Southern Wars were reshaping Russia's relationship with the Ottoman world, an entirely different drama was unfolding to the West. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was, by the middle of the 18th century, a state in slow dissolution. Its constitution was a wonder of noble privilege and a catastrophe of governance. The Szlachta, the noble class, held the right to elect the king, to veto legislation, to dissolve parliament entirely through the device of the liberum veto. A single objection from a single noble could collapse an entire session of the same. Foreign powers had long since learned to exploit this mechanism, bribing delegates, funding factions, installing preferred candidates on the Polish throne. Catherine had learned this lesson early. Stanisław Poniatowski was a Polish nobleman she had known intimately during her years at the Russian court before her accession. Their liaison had been close. Close enough that a daughter born to Catherine in those years was widely believed to be his. In 1764, Catherine arranged and funded his election as King of Poland, expecting him to serve as a cooperative Russian-aligned sovereign. She was not entirely wrong in that expectation, though Poniatowski proved more reformist and more independent-minded than she would have preferred. Through the years that followed, Catherine shaped Polish affairs from a distance, and sometimes from very close. Russian ambassadors directed Sejm sessions. Russian-backed confederates blocked reformist legislation. A Russian-controlled permanent council filtered policy. Poland became in practice a satellite of St. Petersburg well before any formal partition was agreed. The first partition came in 1772, and it was not Catherine's idea alone. Frederick the Great of Prussia saw in a weakened Poland an opportunity to secure the land corridor connecting his eastern and western territories. Maria Theresa of Austria accepted partition with evident reluctance. She reportedly wept, though Frederick noted dryly that she wept and took her share nonetheless. Together, the three powers stripped the Commonwealth of roughly a third of its territory. Russia took the easternmost lands, Polish Livonia, and large portions of what is now Belarus, including the regions of Vitebsk, Polotsk and Mstislavl. Prussia secured most of Royal Prussia, forming the new province of West Prussia, and at last connecting its scattered territories into a coherent whole. Austria claimed the southern lands, Lesser Poland, the rich salt mines of Wieliczka and Bochnia, and the territory that would be called Galicia. The Commonwealth survived, diminished and humiliated. And for a time, something unexpected happened within it, a genuine impulse toward reform. In May of 1791, the Polish Sejm passed a new constitution, one of the most progressive governing documents of the age. It abolished the liberum veto, strengthened the central government, and attempted to transform Poland into a modern constitutional monarchy. Catherine watched this development with cold displeasure. A reformed, strengthened Poland served no Russian interest. She acted swiftly. Polish conservative nobles, alarmed by the constitution and its implications, formed the Targowica Confederation and appealed to Russia for protection. Russian armies crossed the border in 1792. Poniatowski, faced with war against an empire he could not match, accepted the Russian terms. The reformist moment collapsed. The second partition followed in 1793. This time only Russia and Prussia participated. Russia absorbed roughly 250,000 square kilometers. The Kiev, Bracław, Podole and Minsk regions, vast territories of what is now Ukraine and Belarus. The Commonwealth, once one of Europe's largest states, had been reduced to a rump. What remained sparked the final desperate act. In March of 1794, Tadeusz Kościuszko, a veteran military engineer who had served in the American Revolution, raised the banner of uprising. The Kościuszko uprising spread rapidly, drawing in Polish patriots who understood clearly what another defeat would mean. Early victories at Rakławice and Warsaw gave brief hope. But hope was not enough. The Russian response was overwhelming. Suvorov, the conqueror of Izmail, was sent to end the rebellion. The Battle of Praga, a suburb of Warsaw, saw Russian forces storm the position with devastating force. The uprising collapsed. Kościuszko's successor surrendered in November of 1794. The third partition followed in 1795. Austria, Prussia and Russia divided among themselves what little remained of Poland. Russia took eastern Lithuania and the remaining eastern territories, absorbing approximately 1.2 million people. Prussia claimed Warsaw and the lands to its north and west. Austria took western Galicia and southern Masovia. King Stanisław August Poniatowski was compelled to abdicate. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ceased to exist. For the Polish people, the consequences were profound and enduring. Millions found themselves subjects of foreign crowns overnight. Russian authorities pursued Russification, suppressing the Polish language in schools, limiting Catholic institutions, imposing the culture and administration of the empire upon a people who had not chosen it. Others faced deportation, confiscation of property, and compulsory military service. The Great Polish Emigration began, scattering communities across Europe. Yet even in exile, Polish identity persisted, carried in language, in poetry, in the memory of what had been lost, and the hope of what might one day be restored. By the end of Catherine's reign in 1796, the Russian Empire had grown from approximately 2.6 million square kilometers to nearly 4.2 million. The Baltic coast was secure. The Black Sea coast was Russian from the Dniester to the Kuban. Crimea had been absorbed and transformed. New cities rose where empty steppe had stretched. A fleet sailed waters once closed to Russian keels. And to the west, the borders of the empire now reached deep into the lands of the former Commonwealth, into Belarus, into Lithuania, into Ukraine, enclosing within Russia's embrace peoples and cultures of extraordinary diversity. Catherine had reshaped the map of Europe more thoroughly than any ruler since Peter the Great. She had done it through war, through diplomacy, through patience, and through an unflinching willingness to act when others hesitated. The southern seas had been won. The western frontier had been extended. The empire had been built. But the empire Catherine had built through war, diplomacy, and conquest was only as enduring as the foundations beneath it. And as she grew older, questions of legacy, succession, and the troubled relationship with her son Paul cast long shadows over everything she had created. Chapter 6: Legacy, Succession, and the Empress Who Remade Russia. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over an empire when its most defining force begins, at last, to slow. Not the stillness of defeat, but the deeper, more contemplative quiet of a reign drawing toward its natural close, carrying with it the accumulated weight of 3.5 decades of transformation. By the final years of Catherine's rule, the woman who had arrived in Russia as a young German princess who had taught herself the language, embraced the faith, outlasted every rival, and seized the throne through sheer determination, had become something larger than herself. She had become the shape of Russia itself. And yet, even in those final years, the court around her was never still. After Grigory Orlov, after the grand passion of the early reign, Catherine's circle of intimate companions continued to shift and flow. Historians count roughly 12 men who held the formal status of imperial favourite across her 34 years of rule. Most were rewarded generously with titles, estates, pensions, honours, but most were not entrusted with the deep machinery of state. Catherine appointed her ministers on the basis of ability, not affection. The favourites were companions, not governors. There was, however, one remarkable exception. Grigory Potemkin was something altogether different from those who came before or after him. What had begun as a passionate love affair evolved quietly and permanently into one of history's most consequential political partnerships. She granted him the rank of prince. She named him Governor-General of the newly acquired southern territories, Novorossiya, Azov, Saratov, Astrakhan, and the Caucasus, giving him near autonomous authority over vast stretches of land that Russia had only recently made its own. And Potemkin did not simply administer those territories. He transformed them. He founded cities where open steppe had once been empty. Kherson, Sevastopol, Simferopol, Yekaterinoslav, the city that would one day be known as Dnipro. He established the Black Sea Fleet, with Sevastopol as its home. He oversaw the colonization of the southern frontier, drawing settlers from across the empire and beyond, more than doubling the population of the region within a few years. He directed the conquest and integration of Crimea, managing the military campaigns, the diplomatic negotiations with the Ottoman Empire, and the vast infrastructure projects that followed. Catherine and Potemkin exchanged a constant stream of correspondence throughout these years. Letters that read not like those between an empress and a servant, but between two equals, two minds fully engaged with the weight of an empire they were building together. When Potemkin died in 1791, Catherine was struck to her core. Court festivities in St. Petersburg fell silent. Official mourning was declared. In her private writings, she described the loss in the most personal of terms. A soulmate, she wrote, a dearest friend. His death left a vacancy in the empire's military command and diplomatic apparatus that no one could fully fill, and it marked in many ways the end of Russia's most aggressive era of southern expansion. The final companion of Catherine's life was a very young man named Platon Zubov, who entered her circle in 1789 and remained by her side until her death. Through his proximities to the Empress, he rose with remarkable speed, appointed to military commands, honorary positions, governorships, and his family rose alongside him. But Zubov was not Potemkin. He was the warmth of a winter fire in the final chapter of a long life, not the engine of empire that his predecessor had been. It is worth pausing here to consider the stories that gathered around Catherine's private life, the scandals, the rumours, the elaborate fabrications that have followed her name across the centuries. The most lurid of these tales were not born from truth. They were crafted by enemies. The French revolutionary press, which had already turned its poisonous satire against Marie Antoinette, redirected its energy toward Catherine. British cartoonists, uncomfortable with the woman who wielded the kind of power that men had always claimed exclusively for themselves, produced obscene caricatures designed to reduce her authority to something shameful. What was, in reality, a series of roughly 12 long-term relationships, spanning decades of a solitary life at the summit of one of the world's great empires, was distorted into something grotesque, something designed to dismiss her. History has gradually seen through these inventions, but they lingered long enough to shape the public imagination for generations. While her personal life was being caricatured abroad, Catherine was building something that would outlast every slander. In St. Petersburg, she commissioned a sweeping transformation of the urban landscape. Giacomo Quarenghi and Charles Cameron remodeled the Tsarskoye Selo Palace complex, adding the elegant Agate Pavilion and a series of richly decorated apartments. The Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens rose as the empire's first state-run school for women. Ivan Starov designed the Tauride Palace, a monument of neoclassical grandeur that would later house Russia's first parliament. The Winter Palace and its adjoining hermitage were expanded and refined into a harmonious ensemble of Enlightenment ideals rendered in stone and gold. And inside those walls, Catherine assembled one of the greatest art collections the world had ever seen. She began in 1764 purchasing 225 Flemish and Dutch paintings that had originally been assembled for Frederick the Great. From there, the collection grew in waves of extraordinary ambition. The Crozat collection arrived in 1772, bringing masterpieces by Raphael, Titian, Rubens, and Van Dyck. Robert Walpole's London Gallery followed in 1779, adding 15 Van Dycks to a collection that was already the envy of European courts. She acquired the private libraries of Voltaire and Diderot. She commissioned contemporary works from Joshua Reynolds and Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun. She gathered antiquities, engraved gems, classical busts, cameos, an encyclopedic breadth of human creative achievement gathered beneath a single Russian roof. That collection became the foundation of what the world now knows as the State Hermitage Museum. Catherine was not only a collector, she was a writer. In the early 1700s, she composed 8 children's books for her grandchildren, primers, collections of proverbs, and 2 gentle fairy tales that carried civic lessons within their pages. She maintained correspondence with more than 400 contacts, tens of thousands of letters written across decades, many in her own hand. She wrote plays and articles. She engaged with Voltaire, Diderot, and the Baron von Grimm in a sustained intellectual conversation that shaped how Europe perceived Russia and how Russia perceived itself. The educational reforms she pursued in her later reign carried the same ambition. She appointed reformers, convened commissions, brought in British scholars to compare Russian schools with European models. The Statute of National Education, issued in 1786, created a 2-tier system of free primary and secondary schools open to all children, except, with cruel irony, serfs. By the end of her reign, roughly 62,000 students were enrolled in state schools. It was not enough, But it was a beginning that had not existed before her, and then came the French Revolution. Catherine had long corresponded with the philosophers of Paris. She had styled herself a daughter of the Enlightenment. But as the revolution deepened, as Louis XVI was executed and the Jacobins rose, her intellectual curiosity curdled into something darker. What she saw across Europe looked to her not like liberation, but like unravelling. She moved swiftly. Press freedoms that had existed in some form since the 1770s were revoked. Bookshops were ordered to submit catalogues for state approval. Censorial offices opened in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Riga and Odessa, empowered to inspect, suppress and to burn. Foreign newspapers were censored. Her correspondence with French philosophes ceased. When Alexander Radishchev published his Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow in 1790, a work of quiet but devastating criticism of serfdom and autocracy, Catherine read it and saw a revolution waiting to be born on Russian soil. She ordered his arrest. She sentenced him to death, then commuted that sentence to 10 years of Siberian exile, stripped him of his nobility, and confiscated his property. The woman who had once dreamed of abolishing serfdom in her nakaz had become, by the final years of her reign, its determined defender. This contradiction sits at the very heart of Catherine's legacy, and historians have never stopped arguing over it. Did she truly believe the Enlightenment ideals she so eloquently articulated? Or were they always, at least in part, a performance, a way of presenting Russia to a skeptical Europe, of legitimizing a reign that had begun with a coup and a dead husband? The debate has no clean resolution. Both things appear to have been true at once. She commissioned the nakaz with genuine intellectual engagement. She founded schools and inoculated herself against smallpox to encourage a fearful population to do the same. She corresponded with Voltaire not to impress him, but because she found him genuinely stimulating. And yet serfdom endured. And yet Radishchev went to Siberia. And yet when the test came, when the ideas she had championed began to reshape Paris in ways that threatened the entire structure of monarchical Europe, she turned away from them. She added more than 200,000 square miles to the Russian Empire. She reorganized its provincial administration into 29 governorates. She founded and expanded over 100 towns. She drew Crimea permanently into Russia's orbit for the first time, establishing a strategic foothold on the Black Sea that would reverberate through Russian history in ways she could never have imagined. Through the 19th century, through the deportations of 1944, and into a future she would not live to see. And yet the serfs who worked the land she conquered remained bound to it, their lives unchanged by the empire's grandeur. In her private reflections, Catherine knew something of how she might be judged. She had articulated, in the instructions she composed for her legislators, a vision of government founded on equal legal protection and the service of the state to its people. She promoted women's education. She opened the Hermitage to the public. She built institutions that outlasted her by centuries. She also quipped, with the self-awareness that never entirely left her, that if Russians learned to read, they would write her off. The question of succession haunted her final years. Her son Paul, taken from her almost at birth by the Empress Elizabeth, and raised under a court that kept him at arm's length from his mother, had grown into a man Catherine neither entirely trusted nor entirely respected. Their relationship had been cold for most of its existence, defined by early separation, mutual suspicion, and the uncomfortable fact that Paul was, in the eyes of the court, a living reminder of the husband Catherine had overthrown. She reportedly considered bypassing him entirely and naming her grandson Alexander as heir. The plans existed, but they were never finalized. On the morning of the 16th of November 1796, Catherine rose early as was her habit. She drank her coffee, she began her correspondence. Then, around 9 in the morning, she walked to her dressing room and did not emerge. Her chamberlain found her collapsed on the floor, unconscious. She was carried to her bedroom. The court physician, the Scottish Dr. John Rogerson, was summoned and diagnosed a stroke. She never regained consciousness. She died the following evening, the 17th of November, at approximately 9:15 at night. She was 67 years old and she had ruled Russia for 34 years. Her son Paul succeeded her immediately, and within days began dismantling what she'd built. He freed political prisoners, he issued new succession laws, he reversed policies. He reburied his father's remains alongside hers in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, a gesture that carried its own complicated meaning. He was, in almost every way, his mother's opposite. Erratic where she'd been deliberate, vindictive where she'd been calculating, short-lived where she'd been long-enduring. He would be assassinated in 1801 by a group of conspirators that included the brothers of Platon Zubov. Across Europe, the condolence letters arrived at the Russian court from Britain, Austria, Prussia, and France. Monarchs and diplomats reflected on what the continent had lost, a formidable and often unsettling presence who had, over 3 decades, transformed a landlocked continental power into one of the defining forces of the age. In the 2 centuries since, Catherine's reputation has travelled a long and complicated road. Early Russian historians condemned her as a usurper and a despot. Moralists catalogued her lovers. Revolutionary writers dismissed her reforms as theatre. And yet, slowly, the scholarship shifted. By the mid-20th century, historians were asking harder questions, not just about what Catherine failed to do, but about what she actually accomplished, and how extraordinary it was that she accomplished it at all. The woman who had arrived in Russia at 14, who had spoken no Russian, who had had no claim unto any throne, who had depended entirely on her own intelligence and endurance. That woman had governed one of the largest empires on earth for longer than most monarchs reign in a lifetime. And so the story of Catherine the Great comes to rest, not in a simple verdict, but in the enduring complexity of a life that remade an empire, defied every limitation placed upon her, and left behind a Russia that the world would never quite be able to ignore again.